Hi, I'm Elva. My sister once handed me a glass of wine at a family dinner. Said it was special, made just for me. But something felt off. So I swapped glasses with her husband. What happened next exposed more than just a single betrayal. It uncovered a pattern of lies, control, and years of being erased from my own family. They tried to make me look unstable. They tried to take my father, my place, my name. But what happens when the quiet one decides not to stay quiet anymore? Would you stay silent if your own sister wanted you gone? I stood at the edge of the dining room, clutching a bottle of wine I knew wouldn't impress anyone here. The crystal light above the table shimmered like it had something to prove. Marla's house had that curated warmth you see in magazines. Plenty of autumn tones, but not a single real feeling in the air. It was Thanksgiving week, and I had been invited more as a formality than as family. "Look who finally made it," Marla chirped, walking toward me in her pressed linen dress and glass-perfect smile. She kissed the air near my cheek, not even pretending anymore. "Everyone, this is my little sister, Elva. She's experimenting with writing now. You know how creatives are." I didn't smile. I nodded. The words experimenting and little were deliberate. She didn't even realize how often she played that same record. Or maybe she did, and that was the point. Either way, I'd learned long ago that some insults are meant to sound like compliments, and some people wrap their cruelty in a tone sweet enough to rot your teeth. I placed the wine bottle on the table next to two others already opened. No one would touch mine. I wasn't offended. I hadn't brought it for them. Dale, her husband, nodded at me from across the room. He looked tired, like his suit was one size too heavy for him. He was always polite, but never really present. I couldn't decide if he was quietly rebelling or quietly disappearing. I scanned the room. Her colleagues from the foundation were there, as were some family friends I hadn't seen in years. Mr. Rooker, our father, sat at the head of the table, looking more like a guest of honor than the man who'd once carried me on his shoulders through the old farmer's market. Dinner began promptly, of course. Everything in Marla's world did. During the appetizers, she shared a story about how she once managed a fundraising crisis during a snowstorm. Everyone laughed at the right time. I chewed slowly, smiled when expected. My father praised her initiative. He barely asked how my writing was going. Marla stood and tapped her fork gently against her glass. "Before we get into dessert," she said, "I have something special." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 wine glasses on a separate tray. "This one's just for you," she said, handing one directly to me. "Special mix. You'll love it." Her voice was almost too warm. Her eyes, though, darted, just slightly, to see if anyone was watching. I stared into the glass. A faint shimmer floated at the top. It wasn't bubbles. It wasn't sediment. It was something off. I didn't hesitate. She turned her back for a moment to set the second glass down in front of Dale. That's when I swapped them, smooth, without flair. Years of being ignored teaches you how to move without being seen. Dale reached for the glass that was meant for me. I kept mine untouched. Across the table, Marla sat down slowly, watching Dale with too much interest, masked as casual glances. I sipped water instead. During the next half hour, the tension thinned out. Or maybe I just got used to the weight of it. My father told a story about the first time he met my mother. Everyone laughed, including Marla. I noticed she always laughed a beat too early, like she wanted to own the moment before anyone else could. Dale picked at his food, rubbing his temple now and then. His face had lost color. I could feel something shifting, but said nothing. "You all right?" Marla asked him, that same voice, half care, half performance. "I just need some air," he said, his voice strained. But he didn't stand. He started coughing, first lightly, then as if something was stuck. Marla leaned toward him. "Dale?" He doubled over. Sweat formed above his brow. A low groan escaped his lips. Then he jerked back in his chair and reached for the edge of the table. Someone stood up. "Should we call?" "Dale!" Marla said louder this time, touching his arm with urgency, but not once looking at me. Not once. The dining room exploded in voices and motion. I sat still, hands folded. I watched. I listened. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel like the outsider. Because I knew exactly what had just happened. She hadn't made that drink for her husband. She made it for me. And in that moment, I knew. She didn't just want to humiliate me. She wanted to erase me. Dale's chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as his body slumped forward. The panic that followed came in waves. First gasps, then chairs being pushed back, glassware clinking from a nearby buffet, and a voice I didn't recognize shouting, "Somebody call 911!" Marla froze for a beat. Her hand hovered over Dale's shoulder, fingers spread like she wasn't sure whether to steady him or distance herself. And still, she didn't look at me. Not once. Not even as Dale let out a low guttural sound and doubled over, clutching his stomach. Guests darted toward him. Others pulled out their phones. One of Marla's colleagues, Bethany, I think, had already started listing symptoms out loud, like she was narrating a courtroom deposition. Sweating, pale skin, erratic pulse. Meanwhile, I sat back, still and silent, hands folded in my lap. I didn't offer help. I didn't panic. I watched. I waited. And I memorized the moment her face began to crack. It wasn't concern. Not for Dale. It was calculation. Real-time damage control flickering across her features like a faulty light bulb. She kept her voice calm, directing people toward cold water, instructing someone to check for an EpiPen in Dale's coat pocket. It was all an act, and I wasn't the only one who saw it. "He's had shrimp dozens of times," a man across the table said, shaking his head. "This ain't no allergy." I didn't turn toward the voice. I kept my eyes on Marla, who smiled too tightly and said, "Yes, but you never know with these things. Sometimes people develop new sensitivities." Sensitivities. That's what she called it. Dale was groaning louder now, one hand gripping the edge of the table, while the other hung limply at his side. And yet, Marla still didn't show fear, just frustration that the script had gone off track. Minutes passed, or maybe they dragged. I can't tell. Eventually, the paramedics arrived and Dale was wheeled out, barely able to speak. I caught a brief glimpse of his eyes. They were bloodshot, confused. He never looked at me either, but something about the way he avoided my gaze told me he knew. The guests started to leave not long after. Polite murmurs filled the room, but no one lingered. Everyone had an excuse to get back to their car, their dinner, their children. It's amazing how quickly people vanish when the air shifts from celebratory to suspicious. I waited until the front door had closed behind the last guest before standing. The kitchen was clean. Of course it was. Not a trace of disarray, not even a dropped napkin or a wine ring on the counter. But I knew what to look for. Tucked neatly behind the sink was a second wine glass, untouched. I reached for it slowly, my hand steady, my breath measured. The rim still carried the faint shimmer I'd noticed earlier. I held it up toward the pendant light and caught the smallest film resting on the surface, like oil, but clearer. Carefully, I wrapped it in a linen napkin from the drawer and slid it into the tote bag I'd brought. I took a photo with my phone before I did, just in case. You only need to lie once to make someone question everything you've ever said. But if you're lucky, they leave the evidence behind when they're sloppy. Or too confident. I stepped out onto the back patio, letting the air hit my face, cooler now with nightfall just beginning to settle. The garden lights were already on, bathing the landscaping in soft yellows. Marla liked to show things off in layers, inside elegance, outside perfection. But it all masked the same thing: control. Dale once said that during a dinner party at their house, months ago. I'd complimented the table setting, and he'd chuckled, barely above a whisper. "Marla likes things controlled, even family." He'd said it like a joke, but his eyes hadn't laughed. Now I understood. Tonight wasn't about sibling rivalry or petty jealousy. It wasn't even about making me look bad. No, this was strategy. And if Dale hadn't taken that drink, I would have been the one in that stretcher, rolling out the front door to a chorus of well-rehearsed concern. I glanced through the glass back doors, watching Marla clear the plates with clinical efficiency. Her hands moved with the same grace they always did, but she moved faster now, sharper. She was cleaning up, not just the table, but the narrative. Too late. I took one last look at the glass, glowing faintly from inside my tote. It wasn't just a drink, it was proof. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't the one who'd have to explain herself. I walked out of her house that night with more than just suspicion. I walked out with proof. Back at home, I didn't turn the lights on right away. I needed a second to let the silence settle in. Something about it felt more honest than anything I'd just walked away from. I slipped off my shoes by the door, dropped my keys into the small ceramic bowl by the entry table, and placed the napkin-wrapped glass inside the freezer. I didn't know how long I'd keep it there. I just knew it needed to stay cold, untouched, and unwashed, like a truth that hadn't been tampered with. I made coffee even though I wouldn't drink it. The ritual calmed me. While the kettle hissed, I sat at my desk. The glow of my laptop blinked like it had been waiting for me. I opened the draft of the speech I was supposed to deliver next week, something about caregiving, grief, and resilience, but all the words looked like someone else had written them. They felt sterile now, like they were written by the version of me Marla had helped create. Compliant, small, unthreatening. I minimized the document and clicked open a folder I hadn't touched in years. Old correspondence, Jesse. The name alone made my chest tighten, but I didn't pull away. I scrolled until I found it. His final message, dated March 15th, 2017. Elva, I can't do this. You don't trust people. You twist conversations. You make everything about your trauma. I need peace. I need someone who doesn't live in a shadow. That was how it ended. No fight, no explanation, just a cold signing off from a man who once traced poetry along my collarbone with his fingers. I'd read that email dozens of times before, trying to convince myself he was right, that maybe I had been too much, too damaged. But this time, something about it hit differently. The phrasing felt off, like he was responding to something I never said. I read it again, slower, and then it clicked. That winter, weeks before Jesse pulled away, I'd gotten a strange voicemail from an unknown number. I hadn't saved it, but I remembered the words almost perfectly. You don't deserve someone like Jesse. You're going to ruin him. He doesn't need your broken parts. At the time, I'd assumed it was someone from his side, maybe an ex, a jealous friend. But now, sitting here with my stomach still knotted from the night before, that voice came back to me with chilling clarity. It wasn't a stranger's voice. It was Marla's. She hadn't just taken Jesse from me. She had whispered poison into his ear the same way she'd tried to slip it into my glass. The kettle whistled sharply, slicing through my thoughts. I turned it off, letting the steam rise and fade into nothing. I reached for the wooden chest on the bookshelf. My mother's journals were in there, sealed with an old leather strap. I hadn't opened them in years. I wasn't sure if I'd find what I was looking for, but something told me she'd seen this coming. Maybe not this exact moment, but the storm building behind my sister's smile. I flipped through pages until one caught my eye, a half-written entry, the handwriting rushed and angled. Marla always resents how Elva shines without trying. The words hit hard, not because I didn't believe them, but because deep down, I always had. Mom never said it aloud, but she must have known. She'd watched Marla sharpen her edges over the years, always needing to be the one who fixed, solved, managed. I was the mess that refused to stay in her lines. I turned the page. I wish I knew how to protect them both from each other. There was no punctuation, no closure, just that. Like even in her final reflections, our mother didn't know how to untangle the weight between us. She didn't choose sides. She just carried both burdens in silence. I rested my hand on the journal, letting the weight of those words anchor me. My mother had tried, quietly, gently, but she hadn't been able to stop it. That's when I realized Jesse was never the one that got away. He was just another page Marla had edited. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair. My apartment was still, the kind of stillness that only comes after you stop looking for answers and start gathering evidence. She hadn't just sabotaged my life, she rewrote it, line by line, like it was hers to edit. By the time I left my apartment 2 days later, the air outside had that crisp clarity that only comes after a cold front. I hadn't planned on meeting Marla, but she'd texted me that morning. Want to grab coffee? Just us. No tension, no punctuation, no emojis. She always kept her digital tone as composed as her real one. I arrived 10 minutes early at the cafe she picked. Neutral ground. Not one of her usual haunts, but not a hole in the wall either. Asheville had no shortage of quaint places where people smiled at you without meaning it. I chose a seat near the corner, not too exposed, but close enough to overhear the entrance if I had to. While I waited, I stirred my tea, more out of habit than taste. That's when I heard it. Her voice drifting from behind me, soft and familiar, but with that edge she only used when she thought no one was watching. She's always been fragile, Marla said. You know, dramatic. She just needs supervision, not attention. I didn't turn around. I didn't even blink. Her voice was aimed at someone sitting across from her. Probably another one of her foundation friends or a mutual acquaintance she trusted. But I knew the tone. It was the one she used when she wanted people to believe they were helping her manage a crisis. Me, of course, without realizing they were just being recruited. I pulled out my phone, one tap, and it started recording audio. She's unpredictable, Marla continued, laughing a little like it pained her to say it. Honestly, I've been looking into guardianship options, just in case, for Dad and maybe later. The woman she was speaking to murmured something, but I didn't catch it. My ears were ringing. When Marla finally walked in and spotted me minutes later, she was all smiles and calm eyes, as if she hadn't just labeled me a liability behind my back. You beat me here, she said, setting her bag down. That's rare. I nodded. I didn't say anything about what I'd just heard. I didn't ask who she'd been speaking to. I just let her sit down and sip her overpriced latte like we were sisters having a casual afternoon chat. We talked about nothing. Her work, a recent donation gala, the weather. The entire conversation felt like an echo of something once sincere but now hollow. I smiled. I nodded. And when she left, I didn't hug her goodbye. That night, I sat on my couch, laptop open, legal databases loaded. Probate court records weren't always simple to navigate, but persistence has always been one of my better traits. And there it was, filed under her name, request for temporary and permanent guardianship. Rooker, Robert A. I clicked. The language was worse than I'd expected. She'd painted a portrait of me as emotionally unstable, irrational, incapable of participating in decisions concerning our father's health or estate. Phrases like history of mental fragility and prone to erratic behavior jumped off the screen. There were no medical notes, no letters of support, just her signature and her narrative. I printed the document and highlighted every line that weaponized my silence, every carefully constructed sentence that made me out to be someone who needed to be kept out of the way. The next morning, I drove to the assisted living center where our father had moved into months ago. It wasn't a nursing home. It was upscale, private chef, manicured grounds, staff who called him Mr. Rooker, like he was still a man who gave orders and not just one who was looked after. The receptionist recognized me. You're Elva, right? I nodded. I'd like to see my father. There was a pause. She clicked a few things on her screen and looked slightly uncomfortable. Actually, Ms. Whalen submitted a restriction request last week. Something about minimizing emotional strain for him? I kept my face neutral. Could I get a copy of the visitor log from the last 2 weeks? She hesitated. I don't know if I can... I smiled. Don't worry, I'll have my lawyer ask. 10 minutes later, I had a photo of the screen on my phone. Marla had visited 4 times, each entry logged precisely. Mine? Only once, 2 weeks ago, before the restriction. That wasn't coincidence. That was premeditation. I drove home without turning on the radio. I needed to think in silence. At my apartment, I laid everything out on the table: the audio file, the guardianship petition, the visitor log. I listened to Marla's voice again. How casually she rewrote me into someone fragile, someone inconvenient. She didn't just want to control Dad. She wanted to erase my voice, one legal form at a time. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I made a list: names, contacts, next steps, and I sent a message to someone who owed me a favor, someone who knew a judge. If Marla wanted guardianship, I'd let her plead for it in front of a courtroom full of people who wouldn't fall for her curated concern. She wants guardianship? She can have a courtroom instead. The next 3 days passed in that strange blur where your body functions, but your mind never quite lands. I checked things off my list, followed up with the court contact, sent over documentation, set reminders to call Dad's lawyer. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. When Marla made a move, she never just made one. On the third morning, I was rinsing a mug when my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later, it rang again. Same number. Against better judgment, I answered. "Elva Rooker?" a man's voice asked. "I'm Dr. Michaels, your father's general practitioner." I shifted the phone to my other ear, suddenly alert. "Yes, this is she." I wanted to touch base regarding an email we received. Anonymous, but fairly detailed. It claimed you've been showing erratic behavior and may pose a risk to your father's safety. I didn't speak for a full beat. It referenced personal history, mood instability, impulsive tendencies, even implied there were prior incidents. "Do you have a copy?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "I can forward it, but you should know it was vague enough to avoid direct slander." Still, given its tone and context, I felt obligated to reach out. "Thank you," I said. "Please send it. And if anything else like this comes through, I want to know." He hesitated. "Is there something I should be aware of?" "I think you're already starting to see it." An hour later, the email hit my inbox. It came from a generic Gmail, no signature, no details I hadn't already guessed. But the phrasing, it was unmistakably hers. Elva's emotional volatility has always been a concern in our family. As her sister, I've tried to support her, but now with Dad's health declining, I worry she might act out of misplaced stress or resentment. Out of all the tools in Marla's arsenal, this one cut the deepest. She wasn't just trying to keep me away. She was reshaping the way others saw me. Quietly, methodically. I stared at the screen, jaw set, until the letters blurred. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything, but I saved the file, labeled it Weapon 1. That night, I sat in bed scrolling through the family group chat. It had been unusually quiet lately, and something about that felt off. I refreshed the thread and saw it. A new one. Rooker family, updates. Photos filled the screen. Dale, resting in a hospital bed, giving a weak thumbs up. A selfie with Marla at his side. A caption. "He's recovering well. Thanks for the prayers." Every cousin, aunt, and church family friend was tagged. All smiles and emojis. Except I wasn't there. I scrolled to the top. My name wasn't even on the list. She didn't block me. She just left me out. And no one said a word. Not one person noticed I was missing. The next morning, I walked into Marla's office without an appointment. The receptionist looked startled, but I didn't stop. Her glass office door was half open, and she glanced up just as I stepped in. "Elva, what?" I dropped a folder on her desk. She looked down at it, expression unreadable. "What is this?" "An email you wrote, and a group thread you built to bury me." "Elva, you didn't want to kill me with poison. You wanted to erase me with reputation." Marla sat back in her chair, folding her arms. "You've always been dramatic. I'm just protecting what's left of this family." Her voice was steady, calculated, like she was talking to a donor, not a sister. "You're not protecting anyone," I said, leaning in. "You're rewriting the story so no one remembers I was ever part of it." She didn't respond. "You think being quiet makes you safe. It doesn't. It just makes you mistaken for a savior." Marla's jaw flexed, but she kept that professional calm painted across her face. I didn't give her the satisfaction of slamming the door when I left. I walked out the same way I'd walked in, deliberate, quiet, and with a plan. Back at my apartment, I opened the folder on my laptop labeled Strategy. I added 2 new files. Weapon 2, Email Smear. Weapon 3, Social Erasure. I wasn't interested in proving her wrong anymore. I was going to show everyone who she really was. She could keep pretending I was unstable, irrelevant, invisible. But I had the receipts. This time, the story won't be written by her lies. It'll be printed in court filings. The next morning, the sky was overcast. Thick, unmoving clouds hung low, like they'd been told to stay put. I sat at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, the kind of bitter I usually avoided. But I needed the edge. My laptop was already open. I stared at the folder labeled Strategy, took a breath, and opened another file. The one Dale had quietly shared with me 3 weeks ago. He hadn't said much when he sent it. Just a short message. "If something ever happens, you'll need this." I clicked the link. The screen loaded with a low-resolution video, security footage from Marla's kitchen, the same night she'd hosted that lovely little dinner in her curated colonial home. The clip didn't need sound to tell its story. She stood at the counter, back to the camera, glass in one hand, a small vial in the other. She didn't even flinch when she tipped the contents in, gave it a light stir, and scanned the hallway. Nothing about her moved like someone acting on impulse. Every motion was precise, familiar. I paused the video at the frame where the shimmer hit the surface of the wine. Proof. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't damning in a courtroom drama way. But it was enough. Enough to cast doubt. Enough to say, "Look again." I uploaded the file to a private drive, locked it behind a password, and copied it to 2 separate flash drives. One went into the bottom of my purse. The other I slid into the lining of an envelope I'd already addressed to someone in legal counsel I trusted. No monologue, no dramatic labeling, just insurance. By midday, I'd showered, dressed in soft black layers that made me feel less observed, and drove to Dad's house. I hadn't been there in a few weeks, not since Marla had begun cutting off my visits. But this trip wasn't to see him. Not yet. I let myself in using the old code he never bothered to change. The house smelled like lemon wood polish and something else. Marla's favorite fig-scented candles. She never cared if he liked them. His study was mostly untouched. I walked past the pictures of us from childhood. The one of Marla and me at a school play, cropped to hide the part where I'd slipped and fallen just before the curtain rose. On the bookshelf, tucked between 2 atlases, sat the antique edition of Hemingway's short stories I'd given Dad for his birthday last year. Leather-bound, gold lettering, personal. I pulled it gently from the shelf, opened the front cover, and read the inscription. "To Dad, from your loving daughter, Marla." I didn't need to feel the sting in my gut. I'd expected it. What I hadn't expected was the subtle crease in the spine that matched how I wrapped it. The smudge near the edge of the page that looked exactly like the ink I'd used. I pulled out my phone, laid the book flat on the desk, and took a close-up photo of the inscription. Then I scrolled back to my receipt, which I'd kept like a small rebellion, and snapped that too. Evidence. Quiet. Clean. I didn't say goodbye to Dad. He was still out with the home nurse for his walk, and part of me didn't want to interrupt that rare pocket of peace. I just left the book where it was, knowing now what it meant. Marla hadn't just tried to steal the narrative. She'd begun erasing the footnotes. Late that afternoon, I pulled into the parking lot of the financial firm where our family's advisor, Mr. Harwick, still worked part-time despite his age. I'd asked for a meeting, told him it was about updating Dad's documents. Marla arrived 5 minutes after me, immaculate as always, expression unreadable. Dad was already inside, waiting patiently, legs crossed, cane beside him. He didn't say much these days, but his presence still held weight. Mr. Harwick welcomed us, offered bottled water, then gestured to the long table in the conference room. "Thank you both for coming. I understand you wanted to discuss the estate distribution?" "Correct," I said. I reached into my tote, pulled out 2 folders, and placed them in front of him. "Let's start with this." I opened the first folder. Inside, photographs. One of the book, one of the forged inscription, one of the receipt. And this. I opened the second. A still frame of Marla's hand holding the vial over my glass. No one spoke. Marla leaned forward, studied the images. Her face didn't move, but her fingers curled slightly over the table's edge. I didn't explain, not right away. "Finally," I said, "if anyone here thinks this is about money, they've never been the child who watched their name vanish from their own story." Dad looked at me. For the first time in a while, his eyes didn't seem distant. They held recognition. And something else, regret. Mr. Harwick cleared his throat. "Given this, I believe we should revisit the distribution terms of the estate." Marla's jaw tightened. She gave a short, practiced smile. "You want a war?" I shook my head. "No, just the truth. And I'm not the one who's afraid of it." I didn't stay for the rest of the meeting. I'd said what needed to be said. My part was done, for now. For the first time, I wasn't defending myself. I was making her explain. 2 days after the confrontation in Harwick's office, I found myself sitting in the county records building, tapping my pen against a clipboard I hadn't needed in years. There's something oddly sterile about those kinds of places. White walls, faded posters, about property taxes, air that smells like paper that's been sitting too long. But I wasn't there for nostalgia. A line from Mom's journal had been bothering me, looping back over itself in my head like a scratch on a vinyl record. She only feels safe when she's in control. She'd been writing about Marla, of course, though she never named her outright. That's the thing about our mother. She never pointed fingers. She documented. Quietly, thoughtfully, like someone preparing a trail of breadcrumbs. I followed them. A clerk named Rachel, probably in her late 20s, helped me dig through archived files. She had green nails and a wedding ring that looked too tight. "You're looking for anything filed before the current guardianship, correct?" she asked, sliding manila folders across the counter with a kind of practiced efficiency. "Yes," I said. "Anything under Robert A. Rooker. And if there's anything handwritten or notarized, especially supplemental clauses, I'd like to see those." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. After 20 minutes, she returned holding a thin packet, dust at the edges. "Found something you might want to take a look at. Not digitized yet, too old. Dated 8 years ago." I opened it carefully. Tucked near the back was a folded addendum, handwritten, signed, and unmistakably in my mother's handwriting. Addendum C, upon incapacity clause. Should any heir assume undue control over another, the estate is to be redistributed, favoring the disenfranchised. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until my chest reminded me to start again. I scanned the page twice more, then asked for certified copies, and thanked Rachel with a handshake firmer than I expected from myself. It was mid-afternoon by the time I pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch home on the east side of town. The shutters were peeling, but the lawn was neatly trimmed. I knocked once and waited. The door opened to reveal Mr. Lawton, retired attorney, former partner in Dad's old firm, and one of the few people my mother had trusted with anything. "Elva," he said, surprised. "Well, haven't seen you since. Goodness, high school maybe?" I smiled faintly. "I'm hoping you can help me answer something only you'd know." He stepped aside without asking what it was. Inside, I laid the addendum on his coffee table. His face shifted from nostalgia to something more serious as he read. "She asked me to notarize that personally," he said, voice low. "She didn't want anyone else in the office handling it." "Did she say why?" He nodded slowly. "She said, and I quote, 'I love both my daughters. but one of them will mistake control for protection. And if that happens, this needs to speak louder than I can. I looked away for a second, blinking more than I needed to. She asked me not to file it unless the estate came under conflict, he added. It has, I said simply. He handed the document back, then signed an affidavit without hesitation. You didn't hear this from me, but you're doing the right thing. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt solid, like I was carrying a weight that belonged to more than just me now. Back at the apartment, I laid out everything on my living room table. Footage of Marla with the glass. Photos of the Hemingway book with the wrong inscription. A copy of the anonymous email to Dad's doctor. Screenshots of the group text I'd been silently cut from. And now, the notarized clause from Mom's hand. I labeled the folder Contingency and sent a secure copy to my attorney. Then, I picked up the phone and made the call I'd been putting off. Hi, this is Elva Rooker. I'm requesting an emergency hearing to petition for independent supervision of my father's estate. No emotion in my voice, just facts. It was the kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from certainty. By early evening, my phone buzzed. A text from Dale. Dale. She hasn't said a word to anyone since your meeting. That usually means something's brewing. Just, don't be alone at the board dinner next week. I stared at the message for a while, then typed back, I won't be. This time, I'm walking in with every truth she's tried to bury. I turned off my phone, stood in front of the window, and watched as the last of the day slipped behind the mountains. She buried the clause. I'm about to unearth the consequences. The night of the banquet arrived with an almost eerie calm. The sky had cleared by late afternoon, but the crispness in the air hinted at change. I dressed with quiet precision. Black dress, pearl earrings, a neutral expression I'd practiced in the mirror. The USB drive was tucked neatly in a side pocket of my purse, alongside a spare if things went sideways. Not that I planned for chaos, but I knew better than to expect anything else when Marla was involved. The event was held at the Central Hall downtown, a grand, high-ceilinged venue used for charity dinners and political fundraisers. I arrived 15 minutes before the program started. Just enough time to be seen but not studied. Dale spotted me across the room. He gave a slow nod. No smile. But that was more than I needed. Inside, the place was filled with people I didn't recognize. Friends of the family, colleagues, benefactors of Marla's foundation. There were name tags and floral centerpieces, and a large projector screen hovering above the stage like a quiet witness. My father sat near the front, wheeled in earlier by an aide. He looked alert tonight, more present than I'd seen him in weeks. I walked over and touched his shoulder gently. He looked up, and when he saw me, something in his eyes softened. No words, just a small nod. That was enough. Marla took the stage not long after. She wore a champagne-colored dress, hair perfectly styled, her voice warm and deliberate as she welcomed everyone. Tonight is not about me, she began, which usually meant it would be. It's about a man who taught us the value of resilience, of doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. There were slides, of course, a perfectly curated trip through our childhood. Marla's piano recitals, family vacations, holidays, award nights. My face flickered in exactly 2 photos, once as a toddler and once standing blurry in the background of a beach shot, holding a towel. Not one mention of my name, not once. Applause came easily when she finished, the kind of clapping you do out of habit. And just as the MC moved to take back the mic, I stood. I was asked to say a few words, I said calmly. I hope that's still all right. The room quieted like someone had dropped the volume dial. A few turned to look at Marla. She froze. I didn't wait for her to answer. I stepped forward, removed the USB from my purse, and handed it to the technician off stage. Can you play this, please? The lights dimmed. The screen went black. Then it began. Marla at the kitchen counter, her hands moving with practiced ease, the vial, the wine glass, stirring, glancing over her shoulder. Next slide. An up-close photo of the Hemingway book, the inscription bearing her name, followed by the receipt I'd found, time-stamped with my signature. Then came the screenshots, the email smear, the private group text from which I'd been excluded, and finally, a scanned image of Addendum C. Our mother's handwriting, her signature, the clause she'd written years ago. Should any heir assume undue control over another, the estate is to be redistributed, favoring the disenfranchised. No narration, no music, just silence. And the truth. Marla stood up halfway through, walked toward the projector like she meant to stop it. But Dale, standing near the side of the room, gently stepped in her way. She didn't fight him. When it ended, there was no applause. Only stillness. The kind that doesn't ask for confirmation. Just acknowledgement. I turned toward my father. His eyes were glassy, hands trembling slightly in his lap. "I didn't know," he whispered. "You don't need to fix it," I said, voice low, meant for him alone. "You just need to see it." He nodded. And that was it. The evening unraveled quietly after that. No shouting, no grand gestures, just murmurs, people avoiding eye contact, slow exits under the weight of discomfort. Marla disappeared without saying goodbye. I watched her slip out a side door, heels clicking a little too fast. I stayed long enough to see the flowers on the table start to wilt. Near the buffet, my phone buzzed. National Conference Board. "We've moved your keynote to the primetime slot. Full broadcast confirmed." I stared at the message, letting it sink in. All that time, she'd tried to crop me out of the picture. But now I was the headline. I left the hall with my coat draped over my arm, walking slow through the cool night air. People glanced at me, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. But I kept my head level. Tomorrow, I speak to the world. But tonight, I spoke to the truth. 2 days later, I stood behind the curtain at the National Conference Hall in Washington, D.C., fingertips brushing the edge of a worn note card I didn't plan to read from. The room beyond was full, chairs lined with strangers and colleagues, local officials, and families who came not for me, but for something to believe in. It didn't matter. I wasn't here for applause. The stage manager gave me the nod. I stepped forward into the light. I adjusted the mic, inhaled slowly, and let the silence settle. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that clears a path. "I used to believe silence protected peace," I began, voice steady. "But now I know, it only protects power." There wasn't a flicker of movement in the room. "I'm not here to accuse anyone. I won't name names, but I want to talk about what happens when truth is treated like an inconvenience. When families function more like curated press releases than places to be known." I told them about my father, his quiet strength, the way he used to hum old hymns when he forgot the words to conversations, about how caregiving was more than medical schedules. It was about memory, dignity, forgiveness. I told them about being erased, not with force, but with omission, and how the most dangerous kind of betrayal often looks like protection on the surface. There were no dramatics, no raised voice, just truth, laid bare, moment by moment. When I finished, I stepped back, thanked them, and walked off stage without waiting for what came next. Behind the curtain, the coordinator squeezed my hand gently. "You didn't just speak," she said. "You echoed something half this room has lived through." By the time I made it to the lobby, I'd already received 2 messages. The first was from a woman I'd never met. Elderly, elegant handwriting in a note that read, "You said what many of us lived, but never had the words for. Thank you for finding them." The second was from Dale. "Dale, she won't admit it, but she heard you. And she's shaken." I didn't reply. There wasn't anything left to say. The next morning, I boarded a flight back to Asheville. I didn't check my email until I'd landed. Among the newsletters and work requests was a message from the estate court. I opened it on the tarmac, standing by the window. Subject: Final notice. Estate ruling body. Guardianship temporarily revoked. Independent fiduciary assigned. Ms. Weiland removed from legal authority over all estate matters. No headlines, no cameras. Just a quiet reversal. The kind of justice that doesn't need to be loud to be real. When I got home that evening, the apartment was still. I watered the plants, made tea, folded the throw blanket on the couch I never quite sit on properly. Life, it seemed, had found its edges again. Later, I heard a knock. I opened the door to find my father standing there with his cane and the aide a few steps behind. "I asked to stop here first," he said, "if it's all right." I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't stay long, just enough to look around the room, nod to himself, and hand me a worn envelope. Inside was an old photograph, me and Marla as kids, sitting on the porch, ice cream melting in our laps. But this wasn't the edited version she'd used for the slideshow. My face wasn't faded. I wasn't cropped. I was there, fully, freely. "I found the original," he said, "not the one she used." I sat down next to him, the photo in my lap. "I should have asked more questions," he said softly. "You shouldn't have had to," I answered. "But thank you." We sat there a moment longer. No need to say more. After he left, I placed the photo on the mantel. This story was never about poison. It was about being erased, about what it costs to stay silent when someone else is writing your ending. But not anymore, because this time, I didn't ask to be seen. I became visible on my own terms. I didn't win. I just stopped losing to a version of me that never existed. Before we close this story, I want to share something personal, something I've only truly understood after living through every silent battle, every moment I was made to feel small, and every quiet victory that followed. If you've ever been made invisible in your own family, if someone close to you has tried to control your story, your reputation, or your place in the room, you're not alone. For a long time, I believed staying quiet meant keeping the peace. But the truth is, silence doesn't create peace. It creates space for others to rewrite your life, one omission at a time. And healing? It doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes, healing looks like choosing to speak, even if your voice shakes. Sometimes, it's choosing to no longer need their permission to exist fully. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to fight to be heard. You just have to stop letting someone else narrate your worth. So now, I ask you, have you ever been pushed to the edges of your own life by someone you love? Have you ever had to reclaim your name from someone who tried to redefine it? If this story resonated with you, even just a little, leave a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. Type 1 if it touched your heart, or share your own experience. If it didn't connect with you, tell me why. I'd love to hear what you see from your side. We're here to listen, to share, and to grow. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and human, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Your voice matters. And no one gets to take that from you. Thank you for being here. Let's keep going, together.